Hi, today we're going to read We the People by Lynne Cheney. Astride his favorite horse, Nelson, General George Washington looked on as thousands of British soldiers marched out of Yorktown, Virginia, to lay down their arms. It was October 19, 1781, and America, with help from France, had just won the battle that would end the Revolutionary War. For the British, the loss was a shock. Theirs was the mightiest army in the world, and they had thought it impossible that the Americans would defeat them. According to tradition, the soldiers marching out of Yorktown to surrender played a song called The World Turned Upside Down. For citizens of our country living on a vast and bountiful continent, it seemed a new age was dawning. A free and independent America would surely prosper and become a great and mighty nation. The citizens of America are from this period to be considered as the actors on the most conspicuous theater, which seems to be peculiarly designated by Providence for the display of human greatness and felicity. George Washington. But over the next several years, trouble became apparent. America had adopted rules for governing called the Articles of Confederation, and they didn't work very well. Congress, which was supposed to be in charge of the Confederation or Union of States, did not have enough power. It could not prevent states from printing their own money. It could not get them to help defend America or to pay off debts from the Revolutionary War. Other countries, sensing the weakness of the United States, took advantage. The British refused to move out of military posts they were supposed to give up after the Revolutionary War. In Massachusetts, farmers couldn't pay their debts rose up against the government. When they tried to seize a building in Springfield where guns and ammunition were kept, militia fired upon them. Americans were killing Americans. Was our country, which had so recently won its independence, now going to come apart? I am mortified beyond expression when I view the clouds which have spread over the brightest morn that ever dawned upon any country. George Washington. In 1787, delegates from 12 states traveled to a convention in Philadelphia to figure out a better plan for governing the country. Congress had instructed them to revise the Articles of Confederation, but some were thinking well beyond that. James Madison of Virginia, the first delegate to arrive from out of town, had studied how nations worked and was convinced America needed a much stronger government than the Articles could provide, and soon. The current government, he believed, was near collapse. In his room at a Philadelphia boarding house, Madison, a small man of great learning, labored over a plan to present to the convention. His boldest idea was that the nation's government start with the people. As it was, state legislatures were choosing the members of Congress. Madison proposed that the people have a direct say in who represented them. The great fabric to be raised would be more stable and durable if it should rest on the solid foundation of the people themselves. James Madison. George Washington, who had returned to private life after the Revolutionary War, arrived in Philadelphia on May 13th, the day before the convention was scheduled to begin. Although he didn't like leaving his beloved home at Mount Vernon, Washington came to the convention because he was worried. 13 states, all pulling in different directions, were bringing ruin upon America, he believed. Bells rang out to celebrate Washington's arrival, and joyful crowds gathered to greet him. The people of Philadelphia remembered how this tall, dignified man had persisted in the darkest hours of the Revolution, when it had seemed impossible that America would win her war for independence. They remembered how he had given up power after the war when some had wanted to make him a king. All across America he was loved and respected, which made his presence in Philadelphia especially important. With him at the convention, Americans were more likely to look favorably upon what the delegates decided. To the man who unites all hearts, a popular toast of the time offered to honor George Washington. Not until May 25th, 11 days after the convention was supposed to start, were there enough delegates for it to begin. 29 men gathered in the Pennsylvania State House, elected George Washington the convention's president, and made rules, including one that pledged them all to secrecy. James Madison had used the time leading up to the convention to present his ideas to his fellow Virginians, and on May 29, one of the Virginia representatives proposed Madison's plan to the assembled delegates. As Madison, seated close to George Washington, took notes, Governor Edmund Randolph described a government of three branches: legislative, or the Congress, judicial, or the courts, and a national executive. The legislative branch would have two parts or houses, with the people of each state electing the members of the first house. Some delegates argued that the people couldn't be trusted to choose their representatives, but most disagreed. They thought that the place for government to begin was with the people. The national legislative powers ought to flow immediately from the people. James Wilson, delegate from Pennsylvania. What nearly brought the convention to an end was the idea of the large states becoming more powerful. Under the Articles of Confederation, every state had one vote, but the Virginia plan gave more representatives and more votes to states with more people. Delegates from large states, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, thought that was only fair, but delegates from small states believed that their interests would be trampled upon. William Paterson of New Jersey, scolding the delegates for going so far beyond the Articles of Confederation, presented a plan that preserved equality in voting. It was rejected, but the small states would not give up, and delegates continued to argue bitterly. We would sooner submit to a foreign power than submit to be deprived of an equality of suffrage. John Dickinson, delegate from Delaware. The oldest delegate was inventor and statesman Benjamin Franklin. At 81, he had trouble walking and was carried in a sit-on chair from his home to the convention. Franklin commanded great respect, but not even he could get quarreling delegates to put their anger aside. Through most of June they fought, their tempers made worse by hot weather. It was sweltering as George Sherman of Connecticut proposed that in one house of the legislature, states be represented according to size, and in the other, the Senate, each state have an equal number of votes. But the idea went nowhere. Large states were not willing to give up anything to smaller ones. Dr. Franklin suggested that the delegates send for a chaplain to lead them in prayer. The leaders of the revolution had sought God's help, he said, and so should those who were trying to build a new nation. How has it happened that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understandings? Benjamin Franklin, delegate from Pennsylvania. The delegates did not send for a chaplain, but as the 4th of July neared, they did stop arguing long enough to appoint a committee to seek a way out of their difficulties. Acting on a suggestion by Dr. Franklin, the committee crafted what became known as the Great Compromise. It made Mr. Sherman's proposal more appealing to large states by having all legislation concerning money begin in the first house of the legislature, where big states had more power. One evening in his garden, Dr. Franklin showed visitors a curiosity someone had sent him, a two-headed snake preserved in a vial. Such a creature made the point, he said, that compromise was often crucial to progress. The doctor mentioned the situation of the snake if one head should choose to go on one side of the stem of a bush, and the other head should prefer the other side, and neither of the heads would consent to come back or give way to the other. Manasseh Cutler, one of Franklin's visitors. But when the committee took its suggestion for compromise back to the convention, delegates from large states still resisted. Governor Morris of Pennsylvania, a tall, commanding man with a wooden leg, was particularly angry that small states were threatening to form a separate union unless there was equal voting in the Senate. The country would be united one way or another, he said, offering a threat of his own. If persuasion does not unite, the sword will. Delegates also fell to quarreling about who should be counted in order to figure out how many representatives the state should have. Southerners wanted to count slaves so their states would have more representatives. Northerners, especially those who hated slavery, objected, not wanting to give the South more power. It seemed as though the convention might fall apart, and with it, the country. I almost despair, George Washington. With failure looming, a few delegates had a change of heart. In a close and momentous vote on July 16, the convention adopted the Great Compromise. In one house, states would be represented according to population, and in the other they would have an equal number of votes. To determine how many representatives a state would have, the convention decided to count 3/5 of the slave. This compromise meant that the South would be part of the new government, but some delegates hated the bargain. Slavery was an evil institution, Governor Morris raged. The curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. Such words would ring out in the State House again when the delegates debated a ban on bringing more slaves into the country. The convention decided that there could be no ban for 20 years. Slaves bring the judgment of heaven on a country. George Mason, delegate from Virginia. The delegates moved on to other decisions, and by July 26, they were ready to have a group called the Committee of Detail go to work. Organizing the points that the delegates had agreed to, the members of the committee, headed by John Rutledge of South Carolina, wrote the first draft of the Constitution. They named parts of the government and certain offices that the delegates had created, calling the first House of Congress the House of Representatives and its leader the Speaker. They called the highest body in the judicial branch the Supreme Court and named the head of the executive branch the President of the United States. While members of the committee were at work, other delegates took a break. George Washington went fishing. Went up to one Jane Moore's in the vicinity of Valley Forge to get trout. George Washington. Gathering again on August 6 to talk about the draft constitution, delegates soon took up a question they had discussed many times before. How should the president be elected? Should state legislatures make the choice or members of Congress? They finally agreed on a system of electors that would allow the president to be chosen, indirectly, by the people. The delegates also decided that the people should be in charge of ratifying the Constitution. Rather than seek the approval of state legislatures, delegates chose to submit the Constitution to specially elected conventions in every state. When the Committee of Style and Arrangement, the delegates assigned to write the final version of the Constitution, got to work, they emphasized at the beginning of the document that the Constitution would become supreme law only when the people decided it should be so. This Constitution is laid before the citizens of the United States. By their fiat, it will become of value and authority. James Wilson. On September 17th, after the final draft of the Constitution was read aloud, Benjamin Franklin addressed the convention. He told the delegates that there were parts of the document with which he did not agree, but that over a long life he had learned he was not always right. On the whole, he said, the Constitution was astonishingly good, and he hoped that other delegates who had doubts would join him in signing it. Several refused, including Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts and George Mason of Virginia, who wanted the Constitution explicitly to set forth the rights of individuals. George Washington, as president of the convention, was the first to put his name to the Constitution. Then 37 others followed, state by state. As the last delegate signed the document, Dr. Franklin looked at the sun painted on the back of George Washington's chair and saw in it a sign of new beginning for America. At length, I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. Benjamin Franklin. But July 4th, 1788, the people of 10 states had, after sometimes fierce debate, ratified the Constitution. Since only 9 states were required to make the Constitution the supreme law of the country, it was time for a celebration. In Philadelphia, after early morning bells and a cannon salute, crowds lined the streets to watch high-stepping horses lead a parade of flags, bands, and floats. The grand federal edifice, a specially constructed building honoring the Union, passed by, pulled by 10 white horses. A carved and painted 20-gun ship, the Union, made its way through town on its carriage. Citizens of every occupation marched, weavers followed by chairmakers, bricklayers, and gilders, bookbinders by coppersmiths and clergymen. And at the end of the parade came feasting and an oration. "Happy country," proclaimed convention delegate James Wilson. "May thy happiness be perpetual." 'Tis done, we have become a nation. Benjamin Rush, citizen of Pennsylvania and of the United